So tonight I will be refuting Ian's proposition that repealing net neutrality will negatively impact the experience of internet users. I will respond to his three supporting claims. First, that repealing net neutrality will lead to internet users paying more for the same services. Second, that repealing net neutrality will lead to internet users being unable to access online services without approval. And third, that repealing net neutrality will lead to internet users not being able to create content that was not approved by internet providers. First, the repealing of net neutrality will lead to users paying more for the same services. Net neutrality has been impeding what has been, until 2015, 3 years ago, mind you, a free market where price is determined through supply and demand. When regulations such as net neutrality is introduced, prices are artificially raised, especially when it comes to taxes. Forbes magazine commented that net neutrality would open the door for internet taxes to be imposed, stating public utilities are taxed at much higher rates than other property taxes, which means that broadband costs and prices will increase. However, net neutrality was not imposed long enough to see these internet taxes, to fully see these internet taxes. Therefore, if prices were to rise, they wouldn't rise past what customers are willing to pay, provided that ISP availability is high. Second, repealing net neutrality will lead to internet users being unable to access online services without approval of internet providers. In doing research for this refutation, I tried to track down the unsourced evidence provided, because there was no evidence on the outline itself, so I took what notes I could and went from there. And I found a couple of them on the Wikipedia page for net neutrality. The example of Portugal's ISP Mio offering upgrades despite net neutrality laws, which ultimately I don't find super relevant because Portugal's economy is different from the United States and how laws work are different and all of that. And secondly, the example of Comcast restricting access to file sharing networks such as BitTorrent. Furthermore, despite what people think, there are alternatives to big ISPs when it comes to internet access. For example, Scientific American reported that community rented data centers have sprouted up in cities like Detroit and New York City. One example being NYC Mesh, which pays about $1,000 per month to use the data center but does not charge members. Rather, the group is currently running off a grant that asks users to donate $28 a month. If these community-driven data centers expand, they could become dangerous competition for larger ISPs, like Comcast or Charter. Third, repealing net neutrality will lead to internet users not being able to create content that is not approved by internet providers. I found this claim to be dependent on the subclaim that ISP availability is very limited to most Americans, meaning that someone can't easily switch to a competing internet service provider. I found this odd, as I think that ISPs would be constantly expanding and trying to bring in new members and fighting with other ISPs, as they do. So I checked on broadbandmap.gov how many ISPs were available in my town of Wrightwood, as an example of a more rural area, and I found that 6 ISPs were available in my part of town alone. That's 6 to choose from, including bigger ones and smaller ones. Additionally, the National Cable Telecommunications Association has reported that several large companies of Broadband of America, including Comcast, AT&T, and Charter, have all committed to maintaining an open internet, stating, "We stand for an open internet because it's good for business, and our customers expect and deserve it." I understand if this doesn't assuage people's fears, but it's ultimately up to us as consumers to watch the behaviors of large ISPs. With that, I conclude my rebuttal. Thank you.
Okay, the structural stuff is pretty sound. I know exactly where you're going. I know what the advocate's claims are and where you're responding to those particular points. I think you've got good explanations on some of the individual points. It was a little bit clearer on a couple of those secondary points that you had claims that you were making. Sometimes we just got explanations. I thought the price point comparison on the first thing, for instance, is explained very well by the historical context that you give us, and then you've got the quote from Forbes that talks about that particular issue. Your claim basically comes at the end of the evidence there instead of at the beginning of the argument. So that's a little bit of a problem, but you've got good information and an explanation there, so you're on the right track with that. On the second point, I do think that you could use some information that explains why it is that the rules and procedures in Portugal are not really relevant or applicable. You're suggesting that an analogy is not really comparable here, but I don't know what is substantially different about their internet system or ISPs or government regulations, and so as a result, it's a little hard for me to dismiss it out of hand. I did think that you had an interesting explanation that suggested that there are alternatives that people have available to them, and you gave an example of that. And it sounds like there's also, I couldn't tell if it was your argument or if it was an argument being made by that association that suggested that these kinds of groups could become significant competitors to the ISPs. That was a little uncertain. And if it's a quote, that's great. You ought to be attributing it to somebody who's authoritative. If it's your inference, I think maybe we need a little bit more information, but I think it was a good point. And then on the third point, I appreciated the competition argument that you presented. I thought it was pretty effective. You suggested that really the assumption is that we'd have a limited option on the ISPs, and you gave a good example about how a rural area has a substantial number of ISPs to choose from. And then I like the last piece of information that says, and by the way, most of these ISPs are committed to, in their charters, an open access to the internet, so the likelihood of what the advocate's talking about is diminished substantially by that, even if there isn't a competitor. So I think you've got good arguments on all those points. You could be a little bit less low-key, maybe a little bit more forceful on a couple of points, and like I said, I think maybe the claims could be a little bit clearer, especially on the first point. But otherwise, solid response. Thank you.